Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of The Living Story, where we have Dr. Grace Ann Rosile, a professor of management, emeritus professor of management.
Retired.
And I'm really excited to have you here today. I've had the opportunity to get to know you, and what I really appreciate about you is when you walk into a room, you create an atmosphere where I just want to tell you things. I just want to open up to you. I want to tell you about my life. The first time I saw you, I felt this instant connection. I felt a level of safety and closeness and a desire. Like I felt like you really wanted to hear what was going on in my life. And then immediately now, the second time that I'm with you, I felt the same thing. I felt myself come alive. And I felt like that is a really good hallmark of leadership. And that's why I'm excited to talk to you today about ensemble, an approach that people can have to leadership, something that you've pioneered in many ways and really have written a lot on, but also I believe embodied. And so would you mind walking us into ensemble?
Well, I wrote about ensemble from my research on indigenous cultures, and I saw how they enacted leadership in different ways. And in reading some of the historical work from anthropologists, they had a word that I had never come across before. It was called heterarchy. And what they said was, instead of the traditional top-down hierarchy, like we usually see in organizations, that these indigenous cultures from centuries ago, which were much more advanced than we had given them credit for a long time, they had something called heterarchy, where they weren't limited to the top-down hierarchy. They could be flexible, like some modern organizations, more open organizations, flatter organizations. So generally they were flatter. And I thought that it would be worth studying how we might look at a theory of leadership that reflected this kind of attitude and approach. And I want to link in here, a lot of my ideas on leadership came from my experiences with horses. So you probably knew I was going to work that in here somewhere.
Absolutely.
But and I had done many years ago a short piece on how people use a lot of terms relating to work with horses. So for example, the word stallion, people think that means you're the boss, you're the leader. It doesn't. Mm-hmm. It only means in the herd, the stallion will fight off another stallion challenger for leadership of the herd. But the stallion doesn't lead the herd, the mares do. So there's a lot of misconceptions about how this operates. And I also thought that the whole thing of being in the saddle and taking the reins, it's all about being in charge. But as I said to one other philosopher, you get on that horse and tell me who's in charge. So it's not like our language implies. And as a rider, working with untrained horses, I learned that the way we manage things and the way I lead, yes, I do some leadership things, I make some of the choices, but to create our relationship, when you're riding a horse, new riders sometimes feel like at the trot when they move faster, that you're going up and down like this. So I used to tell my riding students, it's more like a wave. You have to bend your body and go with the way the horse's body is moving. And when you do that, you don't bounce. You go with the wave. But if in your head it's this, and your body is stiff, it's not giving, that's what happens. It's uncomfortable for the horse and for the rider. So when we learn to ride, what we learn to do is not take charge of that horse. We learn to bend our bodies so that we can mesh with the other body and cooperate and go together and create harmony. So for me, that's something that's often overlooked in management literature. that the way that we can work together is by being flexible and being able to bend ourselves, to be adaptable and flexible, to create a partnership with somebody else.
I love that. In the social psychology world, we call that synchrony. And people are studying that a lot now, where they're very interested in synchrony. When you said that too about you're not in charge, it made me think of the word willingness. That the horse has to be willing to go, where you ask the horse to go. And you have to be willing to trust the horse while the horse really is in charge. To ride those waves, you have to trust the horse enough that you're not trying to control or trying to make the horse do specific things. If people leaned more into this ensemble leadership, as you call it, also maybe they cultivated their horse sense, what do you think a person would experience in their organization in terms of how they aid their organization or contribute? What do you think they would gain by doing this?
Well, I found it exciting to be able to create that kind of partnership with a horse or with a person, that to be able to work together to create a future with that kind of enjoyment in it. To be able to give each other the gift of that kind of cooperation and synergy, or what was the word you used?
Synchrony.
Synchrony, yes. I think it's a high.
Wow. When you do it, why do you think people resist it?
It's fear, and it's that initial reaction of when we're tense and tight, we're going to bounce on that saddle. And so in a group, when we're tense and tight, we're going to bump against the other people. When we can all get along and we create that synchrony, sometimes I guess people at parties who are all having a good time and they all feed off of each other's energy. So that kind of thing can happen. And that's the ideal of group work, I think. And for me, it's not so much about the emphasis on leadership as can we all get into that state? And then you can shift leadership. One person can take the point if there is a point in leading, and maybe there isn't in this situation. And you can experience different kinds of cooperative behavior, that dance of who leads and who follows, and how do we manage that?
When I'm thinking about in my own life, I crave this ensemble. I so desperately, every partnership, every romantic relationship, every friendship that I have, I crave that because I'm more of a commanding person. If you ever heard of, I think it's like Clifton Strengths Finder or something. It's one of those personality tests. I had to do it in college, and there's 36 strengths, and they rate your top 5. And I was the only one in a group of like 50 students that had this strength called command. And I was like freaked out. I couldn't believe it. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm commanding, I'm bossy, I'm these types of things. And as I walked through that process, I learned that it wasn't necessarily that I was bossy or anything like that. It was that I was willing to take the point. So if someone needed to take point, I would do it. And I would do it faithfully, and I would do it in a spirit of service. But what I learned is that because I was so willing and eager to take point, a lot of times in the groups I was in, people would default to just, oh, we'll let him take point. Mm-hmm. And I'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, I love taking point, I'll do it. But because we didn't create an ensemble, at first it was amazing and people loved it. And they're like, great, we appreciate you. But then over time, there was the tension that developed. It turned more into a hierarchy. And it was a natural product of me always taking point. And then I asked myself, how do I get out of this? I don't want to be in a hierarchy all the time. I want to be in an ensemble. What would be your advice to someone like me in those situations who's trying to move from hierarchies into more ensemble?
So I taught a group class, a class on teamwork and groups. And over halfway through the semester, I asked people to identify themselves as the talkative ones and the leader-like ones in the group and the quiet ones. And so then I recreated groups. I put all the leaders in groups with other leaders, and I put all of the quiet ones in groups with other quiet ones. And I wanted to see what would happen.
Wow, what happened?
So the leaders thought, this is great. I have other people to help me lead. And they were able to share leadership and have a feeling like they had a great group. The quiet ones suddenly talked. They had space. And they were all talking, and they said, oh yeah, we discovered we like to talk, we like to contribute, but we didn't feel we had the opportunity in the past so much. So Mike Bonifer did an exercise with a jazz group. He plays in jazz music in Los Angeles, and they demonstrated how they bring in a new player. So as they play their music and they want to let someone else come in, the instruments make space. They kind of back off a little bit. They don't drop out, but they move back a little, they make a space, and then the new musician comes in. And it's harmonious, and it moves and changes, and I thought it was a great example of how to, shift your roles.
What do you do when you make that space and what do you do when you start making that space, but there's people who start to speak up and be more talkative, but they're not prepared? This is something that it crippled me in grad school. I remember sitting in classes, and I'm the talkative one, and one of my biggest problems is that I could talk for hours and I could take up too much space. And so I'd try to back off. But one thing that drove me crazy was when I was watching students who didn't read a paper for class. Or I just watched them shopping online in class. Start to contribute. And they say very strong claims, or they make these claims, but they didn't read the paper. And then I would get frustrated because I was like, you're not prepared to be here. And I would be like, you're not prepared, and now you're coming into this space, and you're making these claims, and you're moving, if we're riding a horse together, if we're all together, you're moving things in a direction not out of genuine curiosity, but in a performative manner.
So that word performative is your answer. So although I taught in the business school, and although most business people think performativity means that you actually perform, it means an overemphasis on performance. So the word ensemble means that we have a relationship in a group. And from indigenous theories and perspectives, they would say the most important thing is relationship. And so if we're looking at ensemble, what you're talking about is relationship. If someone comes unprepared, are we going to focus on performativity, on evaluating how ready are you on a scale of 1 to 10, or are we going to say, are you my friend? Am I your friend? Am I going to be concerned with how you're feeling and why you aren't prepared? What's going on? So I think we need a balance in there of emphasize first the relationship. In my riding with horses, I did not give the advice that most professionals did, who would tell you, well, think about what you want to do. If you want to jump obstacles, get a horse that jumps. My perspective was, I had my stallion, my old stallion that I had for 33 years. And my perspective was, whatever we enjoy doing together, that's what we'll do. If he never really liked jumping. We both tried it, and we did some. We did quite a bit, actually. And I told some people the story of how he outperformed these big-time, huge show horses going over a set of jumps. And as every horse stumbled through the set of jumps, they got higher and higher, a series of 3 or 4. And big-time trainers there coaching us. And as the jumps got higher and higher, more and more, every last horse finally stumbled through. And my horse was older then. He was not prepared for this. I only did it as a favor to a friend. And I thought, well, let's just see what happens. At the worst, we'll knock over a rail or something. And so he starts through the jumps. We get to the last one, the highest one in the series. And I can feel him think about ducking out. And I thought about, in that second, and this is, if you want to talk about past, present, and future and being in the moment, you have to be in the moment. And it's not conscious thought, it's thought that happens in an immeasurable space of time. And I thought to myself, so I'm going to push him and ask him to go over this jump. And I decided, I'll let him decide. And I literally threw the reins up on his neck, and I did not tighten my leg to push him forward, and I said, it's up to you. And in that split second, he decided to go over the jump. And he did. And after he landed, perfect jump, after he landed, he was so pleased with himself that he threw his head and leaped in the air and almost tossed me off. And everybody watching knew what had happened. They knew that he was so proud that he did that. And he did better than all those other horses that were twice as big as him. And afterwards, people came up to me and commented on him and our partnership. One woman said to me, you're a match made in heaven. And that's, I think, what we're all going for in establishing community and in establishing work relationships too. I think sometimes, maybe at times, work needs to come first. But most indigenous philosophies say the first thing is the relationship.
That's so beautiful, and that's all I want. But what struck me was that in that situation, you and your horse, it was you and your horse, and you created this relationship, and you wanted the relationship, and you were in this together. A lot of the things we do in life, we're put there. We're told we have to be there. In grad school, you don't really choose your classes. You get to choose some, but a core class, you have to be there. So lots of students, it's weird, there's like competing motivations. I'd find that when students really liked a paper, or they wanted to read a paper, they'd go all in. But if they didn't like a theory, or they thought, I don't like this paper because I know this researcher and I don't agree with what they say, they don't want to form a relationship with the person who wrote the paper they're reading. What do you do in that situation where you walk in, you've got, say, 15 graduate students and a professor. Your job is to progress your understanding of human behavior in our situation. But the people don't want a relationship. They're not entering the space saying, I want relationship here. I want to become the best at understanding human behavior. You've got some people there who want to understand humanity. That's why they're doing a PhD. That's why they love it. And you've got other people there who aren't at all sure why they're there. They did good in school, and someone said, you should go to grad school. And they did. And now you're in this place where there's some people with a willingness and other people that don't have it. And on one hand, you want to cultivate that willingness. You want to help cultivate it and be a source and a role model for it. And on the other hand, though, you can't force someone to want that. You can't force inspiration. And you're stuck figuring out, what do you do in that situation? You know? I feel like a lot of times that's where we end up. Places where people are at a job, they don't want a relationship with their employees. They don't want a relationship with their coworkers. They want to get the job done. They want the money. They're there because they need the money. They're there because they have to be there. And they've already said, this is professional. And I guess that's why you would go, that's what you do, right? You go into an organization and try to help move forward the culture, so that's not the case, right? But what do you do if you're stuck in a culture like that?
That's a big job. So what I think of is, you can see a picture on the wall over there, me on my stallion going over a jump, which was not his thing, especially. But he did it for me. And when he was a young horse and just started under saddle, the first person I put on him, I knew he just did it for me. Because he followed me. I mean, he didn't even listen to the rider. He said, all right, I'll carry this person, but I'm just, I'm your horse. So imagine you have a big open space. You have an obstacle in the space. And I'm sending you to the obstacle. And you have to jump over the obstacle. When there's all this open space, clearly all around. So what is the reasoning and what is my motivation for heading towards the one obstacle in sight and having to go this great effort to leap this obstacle? So I think we have to, it's like you say, not everybody has the same motivation. Not everybody has the same goals in mind. And so I think if we consider that difference in their position and take that into account, then we can maybe open up the conversation and the possibility. For my horse, what I had to do, he didn't have the confidence that he could do it at first. And he could, because when he wanted to, he did huge leaps. But I had to build his confidence and give him a doable task. And so when you do a little bit, I was working with a group of MBA students, and they had this huge horse who jumps very high 5-foot fences. And their task was just to lead him across a rail on the ground. Well, he stepped on the rail and it slid. It was a round rail. And it slid and it scared him. And they had told me not to use this horse for these workshops because they said his elevator doesn't go all the way to the top. And he was a little different. So he slid on this rail. His eyes got real big. He snorted and he jumped back. And they couldn't get him to go near that rail on the ground. So they struggled for a while, maybe 5 minutes, and I said, do you want some help? And they said, sure. And these were guys who had done some work with horses on their own in their lives. So I put the rails on the ground, 2 parallel rails, and I walked the horse through. And then I made them almost a V, but still open, and I walked the horse through. And then I made it a tighter V. And as we walked through, the horse had to lift 1 foot. And then through again, and he had to lift 2 feet. And then as I tightened and tightened, eventually, he just stepped over the rail. So we have to meet people, as they say, where they are and be more attuned to what's going on with them. Is it confidence? Is it desire? What is it? Most of the time, people want to get along and they want to be productive and they want to be successful. So if we can help them be successful and then make a choice, then what you do.
That's interesting. When you're talking about this, what I realized, the scenario that I'm thinking through, I'm a peer in a, is it hierarchy? Hierarchy? In a hierarchy, that wouldn't be as big of a deal. But what I hadn't really thought about is all of these students care about what the professor thinks. They expect the professor to lead the class. They expect they're going to meet the professor's expectations. In my experience, all of the performativity comes from they think that they need to show the professor that they've done something, right? But not their peers necessarily. And so what I realize is they're looking to please this person. What I think I missed is that they're already operating under our hierarchy. I don't. My whole life, I haven't operated under a hierarchy. I have respect up and down the chain. I have empathy up and down the chain. And that's actually where I want to take this last bit here. So thinking about ensemble leadership, thinking about hierarchy versus hierarchy, one thing that I'm realizing is that people do not have empathy up the chain in hierarchies. If you are at a chair position or you're a professor going down to a student, or you're a CEO going down to, other employees, very rarely do I see empathy up the chain of a hierarchy.
I wrote about that my first year as a doctoral student. Well, I noticed it anyway, yeah.
Wow, what did you notice? Or what did you write about?
That people don't think of that, I worked for a guy who was hired in the business college, and this was at the University of Pittsburgh. When he left Pitt, he went to Harvard. So he was a successful and important figure. And one of the first things he said to me was, he had given me one of his papers, and he said, "What did you think?" And I was taken aback. I thought, why is he asking me what I think? I'm just a first-year student. I don't know anything. So I said, "I thought it was really good." And he was so pleased because he was honestly asking for my opinion, and he wanted to hear it. And I realized how difficult that is in hierarchy with all of the, I took some courses with communications professors, and I studied what they call communication distortions due to hierarchy. How we say what the higher-ups want to hear. And it was an article, and it was called Communication Pathologies in Bureaucracies. And it attributed the things like the space capsule that blew up. People knew about it. So all those situations where people knew, and how did that happen? It was because of that desire to look good to our superiors, to not tell them our problems because it looks like we're weak then. That whole complex of distortions that happens due to hierarchy.
Wow. Do you think that it changes if you go to hierarchy? Do you think there's more empathy in hierarchy?
Hierarchy implies a flatter organization most of the time. And so the more we're on an equal footing, the less we have that distortion due to hierarchy.
Yeah. I think it's so interesting that we have less empathy for people up the top of a hierarchy. And actually on this trip, I'm currently in the middle of traveling all 50 states. And as part of it, I go to every Capitol building. And I remember in Virginia, we walked in and there's a statue of George Washington. And there was a face mold that was done to get the actual wrinkles in George Washington's face. And it was done true to his height. And so you got the most accurate picture in a statue of what George Washington looked like at a later time in his life. And I looked at this statue, and I never had a connection to George Washington. Like my whole life, I just knew first president, like wow, seems like a pretty cool guy maybe. I don't know. I don't know what it was like then. But I looked at his face and I was just like, this man has bared so much responsibility. It's been responsible for so many people's lives. Just there's so much that he carried. And I felt massive empathy for George Washington. And it shocked me because I experienced the reverse. And it makes me wonder, when you believe a hierarchy is legitimate, that someone is taking the point more often because of a developed skill, expertise, or respect, do you think that pattern changes? That you might have more empathy up the chain as opposed to spread across your peers?
I think empathy is a separate dimension. Some people have more of it than others. And attribution theory tells us that we tend to think that others have it easier. And we tend to blame others more for their failures because they're due to their weakness or stupidity. But I think that rather than, I forgot where I was going with that. I just totally lost where I was going.
That's all right. I agree. We can agree.
No.
Yeah.
Now I remember.
Yeah.
So I was on a dissertation committee, and this guy raised horses in Minnesota, and he also taught high school. And what he did was he compared herd behavior, the alpha male and all that dominant stuff, you know, about herd behavior, and he videotaped his high school students. And what he saw was he identified two kinds of leaders. One kind, he said, he called it the delta leader. Instead of the alpha leader who was a bully and kind of forced people to obey, the delta leader was the leader based on respect. And he documented this in his herds of horses that he saw, and he documented it in high school girls. Well, it was a classroom, and he noticed these cliques of girls and the ones who were like mean and dominant, and the one who was quiet but not intimidated. And what he saw was that the quiet one, occasionally when the dominant one was abusive to somebody, now and then the quiet one would step in and kind of put a stop to it. And he saw this in the horses, the mare that would nip and kick and herd others around versus the mare that everybody followed because she knew where the best grassy spot was and where the best source of water was. And so he compared these two. I saw the exact same thing with my own mare in a herd of just a few horses. When the bully mare was taken out for training, there was a large mare who had been there for a while, and two or three other mares, and my mare who was sort of on the puny side. So when the bully mare was taken out for training, everything was peaceful. Then she came back, and she started biting at my horse and kicking at her, trying to shuffle her around. My horse would go behind the big mare and just stand there behind her. And when the bully horse approached, the big mare would just flick an ear back, and she knew not to go. So she couldn't bully my mare because of that subtle little sign that I'm not going to let you do that. And I saw it happen again and again. And then the other mares started doing the same thing. They would all stand behind the big mare. And I think once the big mare shook her head and squealed and stomped her foot, and that's as far as she had to go. She just said, no, we're not doing this bullying.
I resonate so deeply with how beautiful it is to just see that, to just know that you don't have to be a bully in order to lead. I've had a lot of good leaders in my life who are not bullies. To wrap this up, I'd like to ask you, for people out there who want to experience a higher quality of life, and they want to live nobly, they want to live a good life that is good for both them and others and the betterment of the world, all three, what piece of advice do you have from them based on what you've learned and studied?
I think it goes back to what you said about empathy. And I think we have more empathy when we listen to each other's stories.
Wow. I couldn't agree more that seems to be the case. And I appreciate getting to learn from you today, but also the stories I've heard outside of this interview. You have impacted me and helped me become a better person in a very short amount of time with you. So thank you so much.